Welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe. My name is Jim Rugg, and today we're going to look at one of my favorite comics, Ninja by Brian Chippendale. Ninja was published in 2006 by Picture Box Inc. This is it on the right. It's a large, oversized hardcover, 11 by 17 inches. You can see for comparison, this is a standard comic book. So it's about like an artist edition in terms of its size and scale. On the left here is a mini comic edition of Ninja number 4. You can see it too is larger than a standard comic book. It is 11 by 17, folded in half, so 8.5 by 11. This is how I first encountered Ninja. I found this at SPX, one of the early SPXs for me, probably 2002, 2003, something like that. I don't remember the exact year, but around that time. And Brian Chippendale came out of a collection of artists known as Fort Thunder. Fort Thunder was the name of a warehouse that a bunch of artists rented and lived in and worked in and held shows in Providence, Rhode Island in the 90s. Brian Chippendale was part of that group. Some of the others included Matt Brinkman, Brian Ralph, and they did all kinds of art. They made posters, many of them made music, they had kaiju wrestling matches, and some of them made comics. So of course comics is kind of how I cross paths with them. And Fort Thunder was a very unique approach to comics. So this is a glimpse inside of the mini comic. I'm going to spend most of my time flipping through the book, but I just wanted to kind of showcase this because it is a pretty unique looking mini comic. And it is what is inside of the bigger book, so we won't spend too much time here. But you can see that in order to read this, you turn it sideways and then it reads like 11 by 17. The spreads are vertical. And I describe it almost like a calendar. It's very dense. All of the panels are ruled out the same size, about 2 by 3 inches, so relatively small, which requires you to be close whenever you're reading this thing. The other interesting note on how his comics read, or at least how Ninja reads in several of his other comics, is that they read in what he describes as a snake form. So you start in the top left corner like a standard Western page and read left to right, and whenever you reach the right, you drop down to the next level, and now you're reading back across right to left. What this means is you never have to pull your gaze or your focus away from the page. Once you lock into a panel, you're basically in there until you get out of that page, which at 11 by 17 and with this many panels is a very it's a lengthy read. It's a very immersive experience. So I'm going to start flipping through this book and just talk a little more about some of the features in this book. The first thing that I'll note is this page on the left. It's children's art. This is from, I think, around 5th grade. I can't remember exactly if that's right, 4th or 5th grade, but it's Brian Chippendale's art from when he was a kid. And if you look closely, it's Ninja comics. It even says Ninja in the top. Each of his pages start with Ninja. This one is funny. It's Revisionist Ninja. And you can see, although it has evolved, there's still a lot of similarities, especially in storytelling. Ivan Brunetti's written about the theory of using same-size characters from panel to panel almost creates an animated effect. And I think that's what you can see on display here. And in this first one, we have arrows to indicate, reading order for those first couple. And you can kind of see the ninja just going through the page. And now we're, into this is adult Brian Chippendale. There will be other pages from his childhood, but the bulk of the book is made up of this type of experience. I may have spoken too soon. One of the references that often came up in the early days of reading Fort Thunder comics, or in my case reading about Fort Thunder comics like in the Comics Journal, would be a reference to video games. And I think that's an apt reference, especially if you think of the time period of something like Chippendale's childhood, whenever arcades still existed and you might go in and pay a quarter and just start playing, and you needed to understand that game basically instantly. It was relatively simple cartooning or simple storytelling, and I think that's some of what you see here. The other piece that is referenced in terms of video games is the idea of wandering through a landscape and exploring a world, as some video games do, That is something that's come up. I think role-playing games also have that feature where you're having adventures, but you're also mapping out a landscape. And there's a real sense of that in a lot of the Fort Thunder artists like Brian Ralph and Brinkman, as well as Brian Chippendale here. Other artists that are referenced in regards to Brian Chippendale's work are Gary Panter. I often think Gary Panter's kind of like Neil Young to grunge is Gary Panter to Fort Thunder. His mark making, I think his approach coming from like a punk background are probably some of the comparisons. For me, the mark making is something that I see a lot of, especially like in the Raw Jimbo collection that Pantheon put out. You'll see pages that have certain similar marks on them. And I want to call attention to Brian Chippendale's mark making. You know, you'll see a lot of different textures that are being used, from things like brick to fire to smoke to abstract concepts like these lines, pointillism. So he is really just pulling out, a wide variety and approach to mark making, textures, value, drawing, really. It's a tour de force of drawing. Again, referencing that immersive quality of the snake reading, I want to point out, once you start reading a page like this, you're looking pretty closely. As you can see, this lettering is the size of lettering you would find in a standard comic book. So you're reading this at a couple of, a foot from your face or something. And as you get into these pages, this is all you see. This is your entire field of vision. Your peripheral vision is filled with Brian Chippendale, the world of Ninja, as drawn by Brian Chippendale. And that immersive experience is one of the things that really spoke to me whenever I first encountered this work, and something that I continue to think about whenever I'm laying out pages and spreads with the idea of, trying to build a world. World building, I think, is one of the strengths that comics has. Obviously, not all comics do it well, but I think it's something that good comics do. And I think that's something that is very much on display in Ninja here. I want to point at this page for a minute. This is some of the wildest drawings I've seen in any comic ever. Each of these panels is actually broken up into what I'm going to describe as like interlacing, like television used to have, two sets of lines of different images. So each of these panels, it's almost like two different images are crossing on top of each other, on top and behind each other. Even the dialogues, it's like two panels laid on top of each other. So on one set of the lines, you can see dialogue and image from one panel, and in the same panel, but on the second set of lines, you see an alternative image and text. And it's wild. And to think that this is drawn and not done through some kind of digital effect is even more mind-bending. Here we see a collection of characters that appear to be drawn in that 5th grade style. The mini super team of justice, the evil underworld gang. So again, a reference to that childlike storytelling and world exploration is on display in these, and it shows in the reading. One thing that you can do in a lot of these pages or sequences is you can almost start reading them anywhere, because they are kind of like a moment-to-moment, reading experience. So it's pretty easy to just dive in and see these characters and start following them as they interact with each other and interact with the environment around them. Another artist that comes up sometimes in comparison to this work is Henry Darger, the outsider artist from Chicago. And I think there's two reasons for that. Probably one, this art style is not, it's not a polished style like you would see at, say, Spider-Man or Batman. And I think in that regard, it has an outsider art quality. The other component that would make it similar to a Henry Darger is the world, the scale of this work. As I've been flipping through these pages, I'm sure you've noticed kind of the density of this world. We've seen city settings, we have seen rural settings, we have seen settings that are abstract and defy easy description. It's a very complex world that we are going through as we read Ninja, and I think that that's probably some of the comparison to Henry Darger is based on that complex world that he's presenting us. When I first started reading Fort Thunder comics, the other comic that I felt some similarity to was Jim Woodring's Frank. And the reason for that is the wandering through the landscape and encountering unique and unusual characters along the way and cartoony qualities. And I had a similar sensation reading several of the comics that have come out of Fort Thunder that involve, going through these almost alien video game fantasy landscapes. I think there's some comparison in that effect and that feeling. Some of Brian Chippendale's other books include Puke Force, Maggots, and If and Oof. He's also appeared in several anthologies, probably in the early 2000s and maybe the late 90s. I used to see him in books like Non and Kramer's Ergo. He is also a musician in the band Lightning Bolt. I think he plays drums and does vocals. So if you're familiar with Brian Chippendale but don't know Ninja, you may know him from one of those other projects. One of my biggest takeaways from finding this kind of work early on is expanding what I thought, how you could draw in a comic. Things were so narrow whenever I first started wanting to make comics. There was really, there were house styles everywhere. And so being exposed to these comics that looked completely unlike any comic I had seen up to that point, and also finding them enjoyable to read, it really opened my eyes to, any kind of drawing that I've ever seen could be incorporated into a comic and work. And, especially if you start to pair it with the type of stories that you're telling to try to make style appropriate to that story or to accentuate that story or to handle more of the storytelling than style often handles. Those were big breakthroughs for me and definitely changed the way I thought about making comics for sure. These are fun seeing his... I assume some of these characters are redrawn characters based on those childhood drawings that we saw earlier. Oh, here we go. Berserk. A reference to some manga that comes up in the show now and then. I don't know whether I would call this work outlaw comics or not. It feels outlaw in the sense that it is breaking some rules. This is not what standard comics look like or read like or sized like. This is a really unique piece, and something like this, I don't know that I saw anything like this before I actually encountered it. I'm not sure I've seen anything like it since. There's definitely a lot of ink on the page, which is one of the qualities we give to outlaw comics. And there's violence in the pages. So, I don't know. Is this an outlaw comic? If it is, it's kind of a different one, which makes sense because I think this is a totally unique comic and reading experience. And so that's all I have to say about Brian Chippendale's Ninja for right now. I do hope to review more Ninja comics going forward, and I feel like starting with Brian Chippendale's Ninja is perfect because now everything is on the table. This is such an unusual piece that almost any other Ninja comic I can produce is going to fit comfortably in this discussion. You can like, follow, and subscribe Cartoonist Kayfabe. Remember to hit the bell icon below. That will notify you when we're streaming or when we post a new video. You can support Cartoonist Kayfabe through t-shirts and merchandise at our spread shop. There's a link below the video to that. And until next time, read more comics.